I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to be exploring Logic's channel EQ. So within this track we've got 4 separate elements, and we're going to be focusing on just the first one of those while we work through changes to EQ, or tone change if you prefer. Before we do that, before we just highlight the drums, what we're going to do is just listen through this track as it stands right now. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to solo the drums, which at the moment you can see within Logic's mixer have no effects. There are no effects within this project at all. Now down here on the left-hand side for this first track, the one that we have highlighted, I have an opportunity to add EQ, and by double-clicking in this space, what I can do straight away is to bring up Logic's channel EQ. It's kind of default EQ, which allows us to do quite a lot as far as this sound is concerned. EQ stands for equalization. It splits the frequency content of a sound into multiple bands and allows us to make volume adjustments to them. So for instance, if we decided we want to take the bass content of a sound and make it louder, we could do that. If we decided we want to take the treble content of a sound and make it quieter, we could do that as well. And because there are multiple bands within channel EQ, we can actually make a number of changes to tone within one instance of the plugin. So what we're going to do is we're just going to press play, and we'll see the sound being analysed by Logic before we make any changes to the tone of individual bands. Now what you can see from that waveform is because this drum loop contains a kick drum and a snare drum and some hi-hats as well, you can see the individual frequencies triggering this sort of graphical readout we've got of the sound overall. The kick drum's punching around here, the snare drum's in this sort of area, and then we've got all this treble content as well. And of course, whilst the sounds aren't completely separated, there are high frequency bits of the snare drum, for instance, nevertheless we have got enough separation in this loop that we can make some quite value choices as far as those 3 separate instruments are concerned. So let's start off nice and easy by seeing what happens when we take the volume out of the hi-hats a little bit. They're up here towards the top end, and you can see that as I roll over the EQ, individual bands highlight. So here we have what's called a high shelf. This basically means that if I make an adjustment here, frequencies above this particular frequency point will either get boosted or cut away. Let's have a listen to that. Okay, so I've made some quite extreme changes there, but you can see that whilst the kick drum is almost completely unaffected, the snare drum's affected just a little bit, the hi-hats change the most, because we're either making those much fizzier if we boost level, or we're reducing their role significantly if we cut. So what I think we can do with this loop is to lose a little bit out of the top end. Those hi-hats are quite fizzy, maybe not quite so much as we were auditioning at the most extreme settings, but nevertheless, if we just pull those back a little bit and just pull in that crispness a little bit, I think there's room for that within this track. Let's go looking for frequencies around the sort of snare drum now. We're going to just go and see what happens in and around this area. Now by hovering over this area here, what I'm doing is I'm selecting this green band, and this is roughly the area where the snare drum is playing. Now you can see down at the bottom, in addition to having selected this band, and we can see the band that I'm working on here, down at the bottom we have the settings for that band. They're highlighted here as well. And these 3 little readouts are giving me some really useful information. First of all, this is showing me the frequency of the middle of this band, 270 Hertz. This sort of mid-range area, which is where the snare is kicking hard and producing most of its frequency content. Underneath that, I can see how much volume I'm changing. So at the moment, I'm adding 3 decibels of volume at that particular frequency. And the band underneath, this little area here, is perhaps the most important one. This controls band width. So at the moment, you can see that I've got this area of frequency content which is being affected by this change. And as I change the bandwidth, that either gets narrower or wider. Now that allows me to make much more precision or what we call surgical choices about this EQ, or more broad-ranging ones. Broad-ranging ones tend to be kind of warmer and more general, and they're a useful way of taking up or turning up a whole range of frequencies. If I've got a problem frequency within a track, highlighting it, making that band nice and small, and then making a change to it, a more surgical EQ, can be musically even more effective. So this time we're going to listen, specifically listening out for the snare drum and seeing what happens when we make some changes to the volume, the frequency, and the bandwidth of this area of the frequency spectrum. So that's really interesting. It's always fascinating working with EQ and seeing where the power lies in an individual sound. And here we're still hearing the snare drum, but it's a shadow of its former self because we've taken all of the weight out of it. I'm going to play this again, and I'm going to reset this, and we'll hear the snare drum coming back into the mix. So that's a really significant change as we take that volume back up. So I'm actually going to put a little bit of extra weight into this snare, not a lot, but just a sort of dB and a half, and we're going to make that a little bit narrower. So we're just finding the main body of the snare drum there and creating this change. So we've left the sort of kick alone. Of course, it's going to be affected a little bit by this snare drum change. And we've also got this slight change to the hi-hats as well. And what we're going to do now is to listen to the loop. I can bypass this effect by pressing this little power light up in the top left-hand corner. So now the EQ is still on this channel, but you can see that its light has gone out. It's not working anymore. So first of all, we'll press play and hear the original loop. Then we'll put the EQ in so we can hear it working with the changes that we've set up. And then we'll come out of solo mode and hear the new drum EQ in the context of the piece overall. Now what's interesting there is because we've taken some of the frequency content out of the hi-hats, as a result now the drums sound a little bit quieter because they were providing so much fizz and energy. They were the thing that was kind of drawing our attention. As a result of that, we can actually turn the drums up in the mix now, which means we'll get more kick drum and more snare drum. And overall, it's the sort of bottom section of the kit, which is now going to draw our attention in the context of the mix. Let's just turn it up a bit and hear that now. So now, because of the dynamic change that we've made at the top end of the drums, we've had a chance to kind of reimagine the roles that the drum's playing, drawing more attention to the kick and the snare drum. And we can see that using EQ in this way, we can make broad or narrow changes to individual frequency bands to change the role of that instrument in a mix.